Every person who shifted realities first noticed this. Nothing changed outside, but the inner reaction died. That is the sign the shadow is collapsing. Transformation is often imagined as something loud, dramatic, and emotionally charged, as though reality only responds when you feel inspired, desperate, or intensely motivated. Most people are waiting for a surge of energy, a powerful mood, or a moment of clarity before they allow themselves to change. Yet this belief quietly sabotages everything. The truth is that the most permanent transformations rarely feel exciting at all. They feel ordinary, they feel calm, they feel, in many cases, boring. And that boredom is not a problem. It is the signal that something real is taking root beneath the surface. Neville Goddard taught that states are stabilized through repetition, not excitement. A state does not become real because it was felt intensely once. It becomes real because it was returned to again and again without resistance. Excitement rises and falls, motivation comes and goes, but repetition settles. What you repeatedly occupy becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar becomes natural. When a state feels natural, it no longer requires effort, and when effort disappears, reality begins to reorganize itself around you without strain. This is why emotional highs often lead nowhere, while quiet persistence reshapes an entire life. Neville often described this process through the analogy of the potter shaping clay. The potter does not strike the clay with force or demand that it change instantly. He applies steady, patient pressure, returning his hands to the same place again and again. Over time, the form changes, not because of intensity, but because of consistency. Your inner life works the same way. The self you are becoming is not formed by moments of passion, but by the gentle, repeated assumption of a state that slowly hardens into fact. This is why what we will call boring habits are not self-improvement tasks, disciplines, or techniques to fix yourself. They are identity anchors. They quietly lock you into a state without asking for emotional performance. They do not require belief, visualization prowess, or constant positivity. They simply require repetition. And repetition is what trains the subconscious to accept a new identity as normal. Modern neuroscience echoes this principle. Dr. Joe Dispenza explains that calm, repeated inner states rewire the brain more effectively than emotional peaks. Intense emotion may leave a temporary impression, but calm repetition creates new neural pathways that persist. When the body is relaxed and the mind is steady, the nervous system learns more efficiently. In other words, the quieter the inner work, the deeper it goes. What feels uneventful on the surface is often what creates the most profound internal change. As we move into 2026, the advantage will not belong to those who try harder, visualize louder, or chase emotional breakthroughs. It will belong to those who master the unseen daily disciplines, the subtle inner habits that feel almost too simple to matter. These habits do not impress the ego, but they shape reality. They do not create fireworks, but they build power plants. And once these states are stabilized, the outer world has no choice but to follow. It often begins with a surge, a sudden clarity, a rush of determination, a feeling that now something will finally change. Motivation arrives like fireworks, bright, loud, convincing, and just as quickly, it disappears. People mistake this burst for power, but in truth, it is unstable by nature. Motivation depends on conditions. It relies on mood, circumstances, and emotional weather. When those conditions shift, the motivation collapses, and with it, the behavior that was built upon it. What remains is frustration and the false conclusion that change is difficult or inconsistent. Identity operates on an entirely different level. Identity does not ask how you feel today. It does not negotiate with your emotions. Identity simply expresses itself. When something is part of who you are, you do it without ceremony, without drama, and without inner resistance. This is why Neville insisted that motivation fades while identity remains. Motivation is an impulse. Identity is a position. One fluctuates, the other endures. And reality responds only to what endures. To understand this difference clearly, consider the contrast between fireworks and a power plant. Fireworks consume enormous energy for a brief spectacle. They impress, they excite, and then they vanish, leaving darkness behind. A power plant, by contrast, is almost invisible. It hums quietly, day after day, producing steady energy without drawing attention to itself. Your inner life works the same way. Emotional intensity may feel powerful, but it burns out quickly. A stabilized state, quietly assumed and repeatedly returned to, produces continuous influence over your reality. This is why acting without waiting to feel inspired becomes a pivotal habit. When action is delayed until emotion aligns, you reinforce the belief that feeling comes first and identity comes second. But when you move from decision rather than mood, something subtle shifts. You begin to experience yourself as someone who acts from assumption, not from emotional permission. Each time you do this, the subconscious records a quiet vote for a new identity. Over time, these votes accumulate, and what once felt forced becomes automatic. In the same way, repeating inner decisions regardless of mood trains the nervous system to recognize stability. An inner decision is not a declaration filled with passion, it is a settled conclusion. When you return to that conclusion, whether you feel optimistic, tired, bored, or distracted, you are no longer negotiating with your inner state. You are occupying it. This repetition teaches the mind that the state is not conditional. It exists independently of circumstances, and therefore it is safe to accept as real. Here, intensity quietly loses its appeal. Stability begins to reveal its superiority. Intensity demands maintenance, reassurance, and constant renewal. Stability requires nothing beyond consistency, and consistency is what allows a state to harden. This is the disruption most people resist at first. The realization that the very thing they rely on, motivation, is the reason their changes never last. When stability replaces intensity, permanence becomes inevitable. There is a quiet power in emotional neutrality that is often misunderstood. Many assume that strong emotion is required to create movement in life, as though feeling deeply is the same as influencing reality. Yet emotional volatility does not create change, it creates noise. Neville taught that calm states are the ones that harden into fact because they are stable enough to be sustained. When emotion settles, the inner environment becomes coherent, and coherence is what allows a state to crystallize into form. A useful way to understand this is through the image of a metronome. A metronome does not rush, celebrate, or react. It simply keeps time, steadily and without variation. Its power lies in its consistency, not its excitement. In the same way, your inner state sets the rhythm for what appears in your life. When emotional commentary is constant, analyzing, reacting, judging, predicting, the rhythm becomes erratic. But when the inner tempo is calm and even, reality begins to move in predictable patterns. Ending emotional commentary about circumstances is not suppression, it is refinement. Commentary keeps the mind entangled with appearances, reinforcing the belief that the external world is the cause. When that commentary quiets, attention naturally returns to the inner position you are occupying. This shift is subtle, but it is decisive. Without the habit of narrating every event emotionally, circumstances lose their authority, and the assumed state gains it. Maintaining inner order during external disorder follows naturally from this neutrality. External conditions are often chaotic, contradictory, or unfinished. When inner order depends on outer order, stability is impossible. But when inner order is maintained independently, something remarkable happens. The mind stops mirroring chaos and begins to impose structure. Inner order becomes the dominant pattern, and the outer world gradually reorganizes itself to match that pattern. This is why order inside creates predictability outside. Predictability is not control, it is alignment. When your inner state is orderly, calm, and non-reactive, you are no longer pulled into endless emotional corrections. You are anchored. From that anchor point, reality has fewer variables to work with, and outcomes begin to follow a recognizable logic. What once felt random starts to feel coherent, not because the world changed first, but because the inner rhythm stabilized. If calm repetition is reshaping your reality, subscribe now and stay anchored to these unseen disciplines. Most people believe that self-concept changes through sudden insight, emotional realization, or a powerful breakthrough moment. They wait for the instant where everything clicks and assume that from then on the old identity will dissolve. Neville approached this very differently. He taught that self-concept is not updated through insight alone, but through repetition. Insight may open the door, but repetition is what keeps you living in the new room. Think of identity as an account you log into each day. You do not create a new account every morning. and you do not question whether it belongs to you. You simply enter it and continue from where you left off. When people constantly analyze themselves, question their progress, or revisit old conclusions about who they are effectively logging in and out of multiple identities. This fragmentation prevents stabilization. Consistency, not brilliance, is what allows a self-concept to solidify. Responding from identity rather than reaction is one of the quiet ways this consistency is maintained. A reaction is momentary and tied to circumstance. An identity response is already decided. When something happens, the response arises naturally from who you assume yourself to be, not from what the situation seems to demand. Each time this occurs, the subconscious receives a clear signal. This is who I am now. No explanation is needed, and none is useful. Equally important is the refusal to rehearse old self-stories. The past identity survives only through repetition. Every time an old narrative is revisited, internally explained, emotionally revisited, or subtly defended, it is reactivated. When that rehearsal ends, the identity associated with it begins to weaken, not through struggle, but through disuse. The mind learns through familiarity, and unfamiliar states gradually lose their grip. This is where effort quietly disappears. When identity is repeated consistently, there is nothing left to push, fix, or force. Action flows from assumption. Thought aligns without correction. The need to try dissolves because the self you are being no longer contradicts the life you are experiencing. Identity repetition replaces effort, and what once required constant management becomes the most natural expression of who you are. There is a quiet misunderstanding surrounding SATS, the state akin to sleep, that has caused many people to turn a naturally receptive condition into a source of tension. Because SATS is often spoken about with reverence, it becomes easy to assume that it must feel profound, vivid, or emotionally charged to be effective. This assumption subtly introduces pressure. The mind begins to perform rather than receive, and what was meant to be a relaxed entry into assumption becomes another task that must be done correctly. Neville never presented SATS as a dramatic event. He described it as a gentle lowering of mental resistance, a softening of attention where imagination can be accepted without argument. When SATS is treated as something special, the ego becomes involved. The moment the ego enters, evaluation follows. Was it deep enough? Did it feel real enough? Was the image clear? These questions pull the mind out of receptivity and back into control. Control is the opposite of acceptance. SATS works not because you force an image, but because you allow an assumption to be impressed upon a relaxed mind. The more ordinary the experience feels, the more effective it becomes, because ordinariness signals safety to the subconscious. This is why SATS functions best as routine rather than ritual. Ritual implies performance, significance, and emotional investment. Routine implies maintenance. Brushing your teeth does not require belief, motivation, or emotional engagement. You do it because it maintains order. In the same way, SATS maintains alignment with a chosen state. When it is approached casually, without anticipation or pressure, the mind stops resisting and starts cooperating. There is no build-up, no disappointment, and no sense of failure if the session feels uneventful. Entering SATS nightly without expectation is essential because expectation creates tension around outcome. The mind begins to lean forward, looking for confirmation, trying to feel something happen. This forward-leaning posture keeps the nervous system alert, and an alert nervous system does not easily accept new assumptions. When expectation is absent, the body relaxes. In that relaxation, the imaginal act can slip past conscious resistance. It is accepted not because it was convincing, but because nothing objected to it. Over time, this lack of expectation changes your relationship with imagination itself. Instead of using imagination to try to create change, imagination becomes a place you briefly visit, then leave without attachment. This detachment is not indifference, it is trust. Trust allows the mind to stop revisiting the act, stop correcting it, and stop wondering whether it worked. The imaginal act is done, and because it was done calmly, it does not demand attention afterward. Replaying one simple end scene calmly reinforces this trust. Simplicity matters because the subconscious learns through repetition, not complexity. A scene that is too elaborate invites constant adjustment. A simple scene repeated in the same way night after night becomes familiar, and familiarity is what convinces the subconscious that something belongs to you. Eventually, the scene no longer feels like imagination at all. It begins to feel like a quiet recollection, something already decided. This calm repetition removes urgency. Urgency signals lack. Calm signals possession. When the scene is replayed without emotional charge, without striving, and without analysis, it carries the feeling of something already settled. The mind no longer asks when or how. Those questions dissolve because the state itself has been accepted. The imaginal act does not feel like an attempt. It feels like a return. Simplicity strengthens assumption because it reduces mental interference. The fewer questions the mind asks, the easier it is for an assumption to take root. Over time, SATs become so ordinary that it almost fades into the background of your day. And this is precisely when it becomes most effective. When SATs no longer feels important, the state it implies has already begun to feel normal. That normalization is the moment assumption quietly crosses into reality. Most people underestimate how much of their inner life is spent in conversation. The mind is constantly explaining, defending, correcting, and negotiating with itself. This internal dialogue feels harmless because it is familiar, yet it quietly destabilizes every state you try to assume. Neville emphasized that consciousness moves most powerfully when it is unopposed, and opposition most often comes in the form of inner speech. Words create movement, and constant movement prevents a state from settling. Silence is not emptiness, it is coherence. When inner speech slows, attention gathers instead of scattering. A calm, assumed state does not need to be argued into existence. It needs space. Silence provides that space. This is why reduced inner speech stabilizes states more effectively than affirmations repeated with effort. The mind learns not through constant assertion, but through the absence of contradiction. A helpful way to understand this is to imagine turning down background noise so a signal can lock in. When static is loud, even a strong signal becomes distorted. When the noise fades, the signal stabilizes effortlessly. Your assumed state is the signal. Internal debates, mental explanations, and self-justifications are the static. Reducing them does not strengthen the signal through force. It allows the signal to be received clearly. Ending internal debates is a decisive shift. Debate implies uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps identity fluid. When the mind stops arguing for or against an assumption, it begins to rest in it. This rest is not passivity. It is confidence without display. The assumption no longer needs to be defended because it is no longer questioned. In this quiet, the subconscious accepts the state as settled. Letting assumptions speak without explanation follows naturally from this silence. Explanation keeps the mind oriented toward an audience, even if that audience is imaginary. When explanations drop away, the assumed state stands on its own. It does not require validation, reassurance, or reinforcement. It simply is. This wordless certainty carries more authority than any internal speech could provide. As inner noise diminishes, something unexpected happens. The sense of effort fades. There is less mental correction, less checking, and less emotional fluctuation. The assumed state begins to feel heavier, more substantial, as though it has weight. This weight is stability, and stability is what allows reality to organize itself around your inner position. Less noise equals more authority because authority is not loud, it is settled. When the inner voice quiets, the state you occupy becomes the dominant presence. From that dominance, outer circumstances begin to align, not through struggle but through resonance. Silence does not create the state, it allows the state to take command. One of the most subtle ways a state is destabilized is through monitoring. The mind wants feedback, it wants evidence, confirmation, and signs that something is happening. This desire feels reasonable, even responsible, yet it quietly undermines the very process it is trying to support. Neville made it clear that an assumption does not harden into fact through observation, but through persistence. Observation introduces doubt, and doubt reopens the state that repetition was meant to settle. When you repeat an inner state while simultaneously checking for results, you divide your attention. Part of the mind is assuming, while another part is evaluating. This split creates instability. The assumption never fully lands because it is never allowed to stand alone. It is constantly being measured against appearances, and appearances are always lagging indicators. Reality reflects stabilized states, not newly adopted ones. Looking for proof too early is like digging up a seed to see if it has grown. A useful analogy here is trusting a clock without staring at it. When you trust the clock, you glance occasionally, confident that time is moving whether you watch it or not. When you stare at it, seconds feel longer, impatience grows, and doubt creeps in. The clock did not slow down, but your experience of time became distorted. The same distortion happens when you monitor inner work. Progress feels delayed not because it is absent, but because attention is fixated on the passage rather than the process. Repeating inner states without looking for proof allows the state to deepen. Each repetition reinforces familiarity. Familiarity leads to acceptance, and acceptance leads to embodiment. When proof is not demanded, the subconscious is free to do its work without interference. There is no urgency, no emotional strain, and no internal negotiation. The repetition becomes smooth, almost mechanical, and that mechanical quality is what makes it effective. Allowing time to stabilize identity is often misunderstood as waiting. It is not waiting in the sense of anticipation or hope. It is allowing in the sense of non-interference. Identity does not solidify in a moment. It congeals. It settles layer by layer, impression by impression. Time is not an obstacle here. It is the medium through which stabilization occurs. When time is resisted, identity remains fluid. When time is allowed, identity becomes fixed. As repetition continues without checking, something subtle changes in perception. The assumed state begins to feel less like a choice and more like a background condition. You stop thinking about it as something you are doing and start experiencing it as something you are. This shift is quiet, almost unnoticeable, yet it marks a critical transition. The state has moved from effort into embodiment. Trust accelerates embodiment because trust removes friction. When you trust the process, you stop adjusting it. When you stop adjusting it, the repetitions remain consistent. Consistency is what trains the subconscious. Each undisturbed repetition strengthens the same neural and imaginal pathways, reinforcing the same identity. Over time, the state no longer requires repetition to be maintained. It maintains itself. This is why repetition without checking is not passive. It is disciplined in a different way. It requires restraint rather than action, patience rather than effort. And in that restraint, the assumption is given room to harden. What finally appears as external change is not the result of persistence alone, but of persistence that was left undisturbed. Reality often appears to change through large, visible events, but Neville consistently pointed attention in the opposite direction. He emphasized that the dominant state is revealed not in dramatic moments, but in the smallest, most ordinary choices. These choices seem insignificant precisely because they are habitual. Yet habit is where identity lives. The way you move through small moments tells the subconscious who is in charge, and the subconscious responds by arranging circumstances that match that quiet declaration. Small choices function like alignment points. When they are consistent, life feels as though it moves in a straight line. When they are inconsistent, progress feels erratic, even when effort is high. This is why the analogy of aligning wheels is so accurate. A car with misaligned wheels can still move forward, but it does so with resistance, noise, and constant correction. The engine works harder, the ride feels unstable, and wear accumulates. Alignment does not make the car faster by force, it removes friction. Choosing order over urgency is one of the most understated ways alignment is restored. Urgency feels productive, but it often signals inner disorder. It arises from the belief that something is missing or behind schedule. Order, by contrast, reflects a settled inner position. When order is chosen, actions are no longer reactions to pressure. They become expressions of stability. This does not slow life down, it smooths it out. What once felt rushed begins to feel deliberate, even when the pace remains the same. As order becomes the default, the nervous system responds. Calm replaces tension, and clarity replaces mental clutter. Decisions take less energy because fewer internal conflicts are present. This calm decision-making sends a powerful signal to the subconscious. The state is under control. Control here does not mean force, it means coherence. And coherence is what allows outer circumstances to line up without constant intervention. Completing small actions with calm reinforces this coherence further. Completion is not about productivity, it is about closure. When small actions are completed calmly, without emotional charge, the mind learns to associate follow-through with ease rather than strain. This association matters. A mind that equates completion with ease does not resist action. It does not procrastinate through inattention. It moves naturally from one finished state to another. Over time, these small completions create a rhythm. Life begins to feel less fragmented and more continuous. Instead of scattered effort, there is a sense of flow. This flow is not accidental. It is the result of repeated signals of order sent through the smallest behaviors. Each calm completion reinforces the identity of someone whose inner world is settled and whose outer world reflects that settlement. Small order compounds silently because it does not announce itself. There is no emotional reward, no dramatic feedback. Yet it accumulates. Day by day, these choices reduce internal contradiction. And as contradiction fades, the assumed state encounters less resistance. Reality begins to mirror this order, not suddenly but steadily. What once required effort now seems to happen with less friction. Eventually, the connection becomes clear. The life you experience is not shaped by what you intend in theory, but by what you demonstrate in practice. Small daily choices are demonstrations. They show the subconscious what is normal, what is expected, and what is stable. When those demonstrations consistently reflect order and calm, reality has a clear pattern to follow, and it follows it faithfully, one quiet adjustment at a time. There is a moment in inner work when continuation no longer adds value. Neville referred to this moment as the Sabbath state, the psychological rest that follows assumption. It is not inactivity and it is not resignation. It is the inner recognition that the state has been assumed and no further mental effort can improve it. When this recognition is absent, the mind continues to push, adjust, and revisit, mistakenly believing that more effort equals more effectiveness. In reality, continued effort after assumption weakens stability rather than strengthening it. The Sabbath state can be understood through the simple image of sitting down after a completed workday. If the work is unfinished, rest feels uncomfortable and premature. If the work is complete, rest feels natural and unquestioned. Inner rest functions the same way. It arises not because you force yourself to relax, but because there is nothing left to manage internally. The assumption has been accepted, and the mind no longer needs to maintain it through effort. Ending the day in inner satisfaction supports this transition into rest. Satisfaction here is not emotional excitement or relief. It is a quiet sense of fullness, a feeling that the inner position you occupied throughout the day is sufficient. When the day closes in this state, the subconscious receives a clear signal of completion. There is no need to review events, correct thoughts, or rehearse outcomes. The state remains intact without supervision. This satisfaction naturally leads to trusting the unseen to work overnight. Trust is often misunderstood as hoping for results. In this context, trust is the absence of mental interference. It is the confidence that once a state is stabilized internally, it continues its work without conscious involvement. When trust replaces monitoring, the mind releases control. And when control is released, integration accelerates. As this habit deepens, effort begins to feel unnecessary. You may notice that insights arrive without strain, emotional balance improves without management, and circumstances shift without deliberate focus. These changes are not caused by rest itself, but by what rest allows. A settled mind does not disturb the state it has assumed. It allows it to congeal. Rest reveals mastery of assumption, because mastery is quiet. There is no urgency to check, no need to reaffirm, and no impulse to prove anything. The state simply remains. When rest becomes natural, identity has stabilized. And when identity stabilizes, reality adjusts with minimal resistance. The Sabbath state is not the end of the process. It is the confirmation that the process has already taken hold. Reality does not change through emotional intensity or sudden insight. It changes when a state is repeated calmly until it feels ordinary. Neville's central truth is simple and exact. What you consistently return to internally becomes your lived experience. When repetition replaces effort, reality has a stable pattern to reflect. Boredom is not failure, it is familiarity. and familiarity is what the subconscious accepts as normal. Neville's mirror analogy makes this clear. The reflection shifts only after the image has settled. Calm repetition allows that settling to occur. As modern science also confirms, steady inner states rewire far more reliably than emotional peaks, persist quietly, and the assumption hardens into fact. Subscribe if you value calm repetition over hype and want reality to change quietly, steadily, and for good.